Boldwood presents Clouds Over Blackberry Farm, written by Rosie Clarke and read by Claire Morgan. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Blackberry Farm, Cambridgeshire, March 1939.
Hello, Miss Jackson. Or may I call you Lizzie?
The voice accosting Lizzie Jackson from the expensive Austin car made her turn and look at the man in the driver's seat. He had pulled into the curb of Sutton Road, which led into the little village of Meeple where she lived. Sutton itself was just a couple of miles distant by the road across the hill, and she often walked it to get to the hairdressing salon where she worked. She was strolling back home that lunchtime, as it was her afternoon off, and she had nothing much to do.
You look very lovely today, if I may say so.
Lizzie suppressed a giggle as she recognised him. She knew he was just flirting with her, and he was accounted to be a bit of a womanizer, though she didn't know much about him herself, except that he came from March, which was in the other direction to Sutton, but 13 miles further on from her small village. She would need to catch the bus to get there, and seldom visited, unless she wanted to go shopping, though her mother had come from that bustling railway town before she married Lizzie's father. It was the centre of the railway hereabouts, and very busy on market days, the railway being an important terminal that held many trains in its surrounding yards. Sutton Road was surrounded by fields, trees and hedges, many of which bore blackberries in the autumn. Much of the land in the district was pretty flat, but Blackberry Farm was situated at the bottom of the hill and spread up and over the hill. It belonged to Arthur Talbot, and it was the farm she was heading to now. The Talbots' own land consisted of perhaps 100 acres. They also hired land situated on the Chatteris Road, which was halfway between Meeple and March and had fields in the fens in Sutton. Tom Gilbert was Pam Talbot's eldest son, and lived there with his mother, stepfather, and siblings. He did much of the work on the farm and was very popular in the village. He could, Lizzie knew, have courted almost any girl he liked, but for some reason he wanted her, and she wanted him. The only problem was that Tom took his time, and Lizzie was like quicksilver. She wanted to do everything this minute, and she wasn't sure whether Tom's intentions were for the future or just for the here and now. Was she just fun to go around with, or did he want to marry her? It would do no harm to play Ralph Harris along a little, she thought. It might even make Tom jealous if he saw her chatting to another man, make him pull his socks up, as her father had been used to say. Lizzie's mother was forever asking her if Tom was serious, and if they were thinking of getting married. Lizzie suspected that she had ambitions to move back to March, where she'd been born, but that wouldn't be easy for her. After Lizzie's father had died, they'd been lucky to stay on in the tied cottage that belonged to Tom's stepfather, and was just up the road from the farm, part way along the road to yet another of the cluster of villages in the area. Her eyes wandered to the beautiful old chestnut trees that grew in a field opposite to the farm. Later in the year, they would be glorious with heavy white blossom. But just now, they were still waiting for the warmth of the sun to bring out their beauty. The hedgerows would be full of blossom too, and the huge white sprays of kixies would line the lanes and ditches everywhere, together with the purple mallow. Lizzie had no idea what the tall weeds were properly called. Everyone in the villages called them kixies, perhaps because the farmers would kick them down and curse them when they encroached on their land. The field opposite Blackberry Farm was always wet and used mostly for hay. The villagers often borrowed it to hold the fetes they liked during the summer, and Lizzie sometimes helped on the cake stall. She was a good baker and made cakes to sell for whatever was needed. Usually something for the beautiful but small church that lay to the left of the village centre. A tiny graveyard was there too, where Lizzie's father was buried, and she took flowers regularly. She still missed him. She was about to approach the stationary car to speak to Ralph when she saw a man in the field at the bottom of the hill. He'd just left the farmyard and was walking towards his home, an ancient farmhouse built at the other side of the connecting field. It was Tom, and he was waving to her. Changing her mind about flirting with Ralph, she waved back. "That's my boyfriend," she said to Ralph. "Bye." She walked towards the farmhouse and went to meet Tom as he arrived home. Had she glanced back, she might have seen the scowl on Ralph Harris's face as he watched her greet Tom Gilbert with a kiss. Had she heard the scraunch of his brakes as he shot off down the road, she might have been warned, and she might have saved herself some future pain. But she only had eyes for Tom, the posh car forgotten as she rushed to meet the man she believed she loved, even if he did drive her mad with his slowness sometimes. And suddenly the afternoon was filled with promise. Perhaps Tom might even have time to take her into the lovely cathedral city of Ely, just 15 minutes away. It was a Thursday and market day, and Lizzie would love to buy herself a new skirt, if only Tom could spare the time to take her. They might even buy fish and chips from the shop on the market square and take it to eat by the river. "Wipe your feet, John." Pam Talbot smiled at her youngest son that evening, 1 week after Tom had taken Lizzie into Ely to buy a new skirt, as she reminded him of his manners. "This is your own, not a building site." "Oh, Ma," John said, looking down at his boots. "They're not dirty." "John, do as your mother tells you." Arthur Talbot frowned at him. "Your mother rules the house, and if she wants you to take off your boots when you enter the kitchen, you do it, understood?" John didn't answer, but bent and untied the laces of the heavy boots he wore in his job as a plasterer. He was right to say his boots were not dirty, for the building site he'd been on that day was almost finished, all mud and mess cleared from sight. But John never argued with his father. "If I scrub this floor once a day, I consider that's enough." Pam spoke to no one in particular. "I know none of you can help fetching mud in from the farm, but you can remove your boots. Now, no more on the subject. Just sit down and have your tea, John. You're the last in, but I saved you a nice portion of my beef and ale pie. I know it's your favourite." "Oh, I'm starving," John said, and flashed a brilliant smile at his mother. "Has he got mushrooms?" "Of course. Tom picked them for me first thing. A great big basketful. We had some for our docky, but I saved some for the pie, because I know how much you love them, John." Pam smiled at the son who resembled her the most. John had her fair hair and soft, slightly feminine features, with grey eyes and a smile that lit up the room. He was giving her that special look now. Tom was her eldest son, on the way when she married John's father, and he did lots of chores for her, but his work was on the farm, and he was her husband's chief man, the only one who could work this difficult land as it ought to be. He'd brought her the mushrooms when he came in for his docky, which was the farming folks' word for an early lunch. It was eaten around 11:30, and a cold meal as a rule, though sometimes Pam did a fry-up, which they all loved. She cooked a full meal in the evenings, when they could all sit down together if they chose. All her children were special to her, but perhaps Tom and John were her favourites, though she tried to treat and love them all equally. Artie was different, a bit more reserved, and not as easy to please. Susan and Angela were also special in their different ways, but perhaps a mother always had a soft spot for her boys. "I got something for you today," John told her, and glanced briefly at his father sitting in the wooden rocking chair by the fire. "I'll give it to you later." "You spoil me," Pam said, because her youngest son was always buying her small gifts. A piece of glass for her collection that graced the front parlour, or an inexpensive silver brooch. She had tried to stop him, and Arthur said he was a fool to spend his money on junk. But John enjoyed giving her things, and she enjoyed having them. Flowers were her favourite, and he bought her a posy most weeks when he was paid. But this wasn't payday, and by the look on John's face, it was something a bit special.
"That bloody Hitler!"
Arthur's snort of disgust made his wife and son look at him.
"Someone ought to shoot him before he gets us all into a lot of trouble."
They both had vivid memories of the last war, having lived through it. Arthur hadn't been called up because he'd been needed on the farm, land which had been in his family for several generations. He'd actually tried to enlist, but they told him he had flat feet and would be more useful where he was, producing food for the nation. Had he been a soldier, Pam might never have met him just when she'd needed his love and kindness so badly.
"What has he done now, Arthur?"
she asked.
"It's what he's threatening to do,"
her husband muttered, and subsided behind his Daily Mail without making it any clearer just what the German dictator had been up to this time. They all knew Arthur's opinion of Hitler and what was happening to the Jewish people over there. But the family normally avoided the subject, rather than see him get angry and frustrated because nothing was being done about it by the British government. Hitler had entered Austria to cheers and enthusiasm earlier that month, and some feared that his welcome had led him to think he could simply do the same with the rest of Europe. Pam didn't pursue the question. She was used to Arthur's outbursts that were seldom elaborated on, and since she'd read the headlines herself, she was well aware of Hitler's threats and the way his followers were treating the Jews, which she thought terrible. But that was out there in Germany, and it felt like it had nothing to do with her or her family. The newspapers were always talking about the possibility of war. But in March 1939, it was still peaceful on the Talbot's farm, though building work was going on all over the country in preparation for the hostilities that sometimes seemed inevitable. Trouble was brewing in Germany, and when that spilled over, it was almost certain to result in another terrible war. In London, she knew, trenches had been dug in the park to shelter the citizens should the bombs start to fall, and some folk were digging air raid shelters in their back gardens just in case. Also, there were airfields and army barracks being erected everywhere. It was rumoured the government wanted some of the Talbots' land, though they hadn't been informed officially yet. Pam's thoughts were turned as her eldest son Tom entered the kitchen. He had been up to their modern bathroom, a great luxury Arthur had had installed in the ancient farmhouse for her just the previous year, for a wash and a shave. The smell of imperial leather wafted in with him, and she smiled, because he was so tall and strong and handsome in his own way, though perhaps others might just see his square jaw and miss the beauty of those deep grey eyes and dark wavy hair. He was also a clever farmer and a dutiful son to his parents, so much so that Arthur favoured him above his own sons at times.
"You look nice, love,"
Pam said, looking fondly at him.
"Are you going to see Lizzie tonight?"
Lizzie Jackson was his regular girlfriend, and there was vague talk of a marriage one day, though neither of them seemed in a hurry.
"Not tonight, Ma," Tom said. "She's doing her mother's hair. Something called a perm, I think she called it. No, I'm off to the pub. We got a darts match on this evening."
"We'll have a good time, love, and don't do anything I wouldn't," Pam teased with a twinkle in her eye. Arthur snorted from behind the paper, and John laughed out loud.
"That means you can do whatever you like," he said. "Our Ma was a right cracker when she was your age."
Arthur rattled his paper and looked over it at his youngest son.
"Your mother was a perfectly decent young woman. I won't have you take her name in vain. I can still give you a good hiding, boy, and don't you forget it."
"He's only teasing, Arthur," Pam said. "Besides, my lads know I enjoyed a few drinks and a bit of fun when we were young. Good, innocent fun never hurt anyone."
"I'm off, Ma,"
Tom said, and gave her still slim waist a squeeze. "You're the best mum ever.
and if anyone said any different, we'd make them eat their words. John never thinks before he speaks. He looked warningly at his brother, who seemed as if he might protest, but then thought better of it. I shan't be late, Dad. We've got an early start in the morning. Those bullocks need fetching up from the washes if they're off to the market in Ely on Thursday. That's right, son.
Arthur looked approvingly at the son his wife had been carrying before he'd met her. Arthur had ignored all those who said she was fast and listened to Pam's story. Tommy Gilbert had gone for a soldier in 1914, and she'd given herself to him the night before he left with his promise of marriage when he returned. She loved him so much and wanted to make him happy that last night. But he'd been killed in his first encounter with the enemy, and Pam had had to face the disgrace of giving birth to a child out of wedlock. She'd been willing to do it, grieving for her lost love. But then Arthur asked her to wed him, and she saw a better life for herself and her son. Arthur hadn't cared one jot that she was close to giving birth to a child. He'd known she was for him the moment he saw her, and he loved Tom as much as his own children, perhaps more. Pam considered herself lucky, because the love she'd discovered had been good for them all. But Arthur always told her that he was the lucky one, because he'd got two good things in his life for the price of one. As he'd told her, "You know I like a good bargain, love." His smile had been teasing, but Pam knew that she was loved. Arthur was smiling his approval at Tom now.
I know I can rely on you to do what's right, son.
Tom nodded and left just as his brother Artie entered the house. Artie had been out to bring in coal and chop wood for their mother. Artie worked on the farm just as Tom did, and they were good friends.
That's a good lad,
said Arthur as he saw the logs his eldest son had chopped.
That'll keep your mother going tomorrow. Are you off out now?
I'm just going into Chatteris, Artie said. My mate George is going to give my motorbike a service, and I'll help him. I may be late back. Be careful on that thing, Pam said, looking at her 19-year-old anxiously. Chatteris might only be 5 miles away, but she didn't like motorbikes. However, Arthur said you had to let lads go their own way, and Artie was sensible. He'd saved for his bike himself and was a careful rider. I'm always careful, Ma, Artie said, and kissed her on the cheek. I've got too much to live for to be stupid. Don't you worry.
Your ma will always worry,
Arthur said, and glanced at Pam.
I think I'll take a last walk round, make sure the beasts are all right before I settle for the night.
All right, Pam said, and smiled fondly at her husband. Why don't you wander down the pub and have a pint?
Tom will think I'm checking up on him,
Arthur replied. Tom would be in the local pub by the river, the Three Pickerels, and Arthur didn't like to intrude on his free time.
There's a beer in the pantry. I'll have that when I get back, and then listen to the wireless for a while. Henry Hall is on tonight.
All right, love, Pam agreed, because she liked listening to Henry Hall's orchestra too. They played all the popular tunes. I'm going up to ask Susan in a minute, and I'll make sure she's done her homework. She's a good girl, but it's maths tonight, and that's not her favourite. Their 16-year-old daughter was staying on at school to take her higher exams because she thought she wanted to become a teacher, and that suited her parents. She hadn't passed her exam for the high school in Ely, so she went to the senior school in Chatteris, like all the kids from Meeple and Sutton. They all caught the bus to and from school, unless they missed it and had to walk all the way in, which a couple of boys who had to work on their parents' smallholding had been known to do now and then. However, there was a pleasant little school for the younger ones in the village. Teaching was a good, steady job that a girl could return to in later life, even if she married and had children, which for a pretty girl like their Susan was very likely. Her teacher had told them that it was still possible for her to win a place in college if she worked hard. But would she? Arthur said she was nearly as beautiful as her mother had been when she was young, and she had the same fair hair with the same sweet mouth and smile, but blue rather than grey eyes. But then he was prejudiced in her favour, and it would be hard to say whether he was prouder of his wife or his daughter. A man of few words, a grunt of approval was all his wife ever needed to know that he was pleased with her. Pam smiled as her husband shrugged on his thick jacket and went out. Only John was left with her now, and as expected, he got up and went to fetch something from his jacket pocket. He handed her a small black cardboard box, and Pam opened it, feeling surprised as she saw the lovely earrings nestling in cotton wool inside. They were for pierced ears, which he'd had done some years ago, and had gold loops with a single oval moonstone drop rimmed with gold, and were delicate and pretty. "Oh, John," she said reverently, "where on earth did you find these? They are beautiful. Thank you so much." She kissed his cheek. "Really, you shouldn't, love."
"I thought you would like them," John replied, looking pleased. "I had to go into March for my boss this afternoon, and I looked in the jeweller's window and saw those. He told me they're Victorian, and I know you like old things."
John's boss was a builder and bricklayer himself, but John had learned the art of plastering, which made him valuable to a small firm like Jack Freeman's. "I love them, John," she assured him. "They are wonderful, but they cost a bit, and you should save your money, love. One day you will want to marry and have a home of your own."
"I'll not marry, not for a long time anyway," John told her. "You're my best girl, Ma. I like to buy you things, and I'm earning good money now. Jack Freeman was saying that he thinks I'm the best worker he has, and he put my money up."
John sipped the hot, strong tea his mother poured him.
"Jack has no children, Ma. He asked me if I would consider going in with him as a junior partner. I said I'd give it some thought."
"That's a marvellous chance for you," Pam said, looking at him in surprise. "Why didn't you say yes immediately?"
"I thought it might upset Pa," John replied, looking at her anxiously. "I know I'm a disappointment to him, because I didn't want to work on the farm."
"Bless you, boy. He's got 2 sons to take over when he wants a bit of an easy life. Why should he begrudge you a chance like that? Do you have to pay anything to become a partner?" John shook his head.
"I asked him. I've got a little bit saved in the post office, but he said no. He would give it to me. He reckons I've earned it, and it will keep me loyal to the firm, and I'll take over the running of the business in years to come, allowing him an easier time. I've had a few offers to go elsewhere, see, and Jack knows it. He wants to keep me."
Pam nodded, her smile warm for her youngest boy. She was well aware that Arthur sometimes felt cheated because John had chosen to work elsewhere, and that he could not please his father whatever he did. John felt his father's disappointment keenly, but he'd chosen his profession, and she hadn't questioned it, and now she felt proud of his determination and the high opinion his boss had of him. "Well, you do what you want, love, and don't worry about your dad. He loves you, John, even if he doesn't show it much."
"I know it, Ma," John said. "When I was younger, I felt his disapproval. But when I had that bad attack of measles 4 years ago, I woke to find him crying by my bed and stroking my head. I knew he loved me then, even though he was so angry when I went to work for Jack."
"Arthur is a good man," Pam said. "He was upset, but he told me the other day he'd seen some of your work and thought it was good."
"I wonder where he saw that," John said, a little surprised. "Unless he went to the market in March."
"He did," Pam nodded. "It was that evening he told me you were a craftsman. I think he'd had a look round a new house that's been offered for sale there."
"Ah, yes. That was a good job. I did some special work on the ceiling rows for that client," John said. "Well, fancy Dad seeing that." He smiled to himself. "I'm going up for a wash, and then I'll get to bed."
"Not going out this evening?" Pam looked at him.
You could go and watch Tom play darts. No, I've got a new Agatha Christie I want to read. I'll just read for a while and then get some rest. We've got 3 houses to plaster this week, and I'll be working later tomorrow. You do as you like, love, and thank you again for my gorgeous gift. Pam nodded as he left the room. She liked a good book herself, and John would pass his new book on to her when he'd finished it. She glanced at the clock. It was just 8, according to the old-fashioned marble timepiece Arthur set such store by. Time she went up to make certain Susan was doing her homework and not painting her toenails or reading a Mills and Boon romance. She would pop in on her youngest daughter Angela too, make sure she was asleep. She glanced at the basket of ironing and sighed. Having a big family was wonderful, but there was always a lot of washing and ironing to do. When she came down, Arthur would be back. He would click the wireless on, and she could listen to some music while she ironed all those shirts. Chapter 2. Take that back. It's a damn lie, Tom Gilbert said, glaring at the man who had just spoken in such a slighting way of Lizzie. How dare you say such a foul thing? The buzz of talk behind him quietened immediately, as the pub's customers sensed a fight, everyone watching intently as the two men squared up. She's playing you for a fool, Fred Barker said with a sly leer. She's been seeing that bloke from March behind your back for months. Tom had known Fred for years. He was the same age, but worked in the Ely Ales brewery at the bottom of Forehill in Ely, and was a loudmouth. But this time he'd gone too far. That's a lie, Tom shouted, and his fists balled at his sides. Take it back, Fred, or I'll knock your head off. I'm warning you. I'm telling you for your own good, but you're too thick to see it. Take no notice of him, Tom. His friend Steve placed a hand on his shoulder. He's just jealous because Lizzie wouldn't look at him. She's a slut. Fred Barker pushed his luck too far, and Tom's fist exploded in his face. Fred rocked on his feet, and then flung himself at his rival with fists and feet as the room burst into feverish life behind them, men cheering on both sides as the fighting ensued. Fred landed a few blows, but they glanced off Tom's chin, and Tom's second punch sent Fred down to the floor, where he lay with his eyes closed, and several voices exclaimed in disappointment. You might have made it last a bit longer, Tom. I was just enjoying that, one old-timer said behind him. The damned fool should have known better than to quarrel with you. Tom felt several of his mates clap him on the shoulder. Even that gypsy lad you suspected of stealing chickens the other year lasted longer than that, one of them said. They had all known what was going on, but there had been no way to prove it. But when the travelling fair had come to Sutton that year, and the gypsy lad had entered the bare-knuckle contest, Tom had decided to teach him a lesson in the ring. After he'd knocked him down 3 times, Tom had warned him what would happen if he kept stealing from him and his neighbours. His hands had been sore for a week, but it had been worth it. The thefts had stopped after the fight. Bloody fool, Pete Green said, looking at the man on the floor in disgust. Don't they know you're the champ? I don't fight unless provoked, Tom said ruefully as Fred stirred. He regretted the lapse that had made him strike a man he'd known couldn't stand up to him. You should enter the fight contest again when the Midsummer Fair comes to March, one of Tom's friends said. There's a prize of £20 this year. I reckon you could take it easy, Tom. I told you, I don't fight unless provoked, Tom said, looking down at Fred as he staggered, trying to rise straight on his feet and failing. Someone get him out of here. I don't want to kill him. Leave that to me, Jim Marshall, the local police constable, said, and together with another man, they pulled Fred to his feet and hauled him out into the cool night air. Over his shoulder, he said, He asked for it, Tom. There will be no trouble from me. He's had it coming for a while. I've seen him driving his van like crazy after he's been drinking. Maybe this will teach him a lesson. If not, I'll be arresting him for behaving like a fool when he's had too much. If he spends a night in the police cells in Ely, he'll likely come to his senses." "Thanks, Jim," Tom said, and frowned. "I'm sorry I hit him, though. I should have held my temper." "He deserved it." Tom nodded as the luckless Fred disappeared from sight. He would wake to a sore chin and a headache, and it served him right. The memory of his words made Tom frown. There was no truth in what he'd said. Lizzie was at home doing her mother's hair. Why should she lie to him? Tom had never asked for her promise to be true to only him. He'd taken it for granted they would marry one day, but neither of them was in a hurry. If Lizzie wanted to be with someone else, she would tell him, wouldn't she? He grimaced. Of course she would, he reasoned. He wouldn't let a nothing like Fred Barker make him suspicious of the girl he admired for her ambition and her determination to become a top-class hairdresser. No, Lizzie was straight. She wouldn't lie to him. "Now maybe we can continue our match in peace," another voice said. "Or do you want to retire?" Tom looked at the man who had spoken with a slightly derisive note in his voice and glared at him. His hand was sore after punching Fred so hard, but he would rather suffer a dozen times the pain than let Ralph Harris have the last say. Now, if he'd been the one to get hit, Tom would have enjoyed knocking him down, but Ralph was too smart to provoke him to anger. Ralph worked for himself, though no one was quite sure what he did. Some kind of dealing, none too honest was the general opinion. He was the same age as Tom, and had gone to Chatteris School at the same time. But he hadn't excelled at anything that mattered. Yes, he was close to top in maths, history and science, but he was no good at woodwork or sport, the only two subjects that held much interest for the local boys. Tom was good at anything that interested him, which was working with his hands, driving and sport. "No thanks," Tom said, and grinned. "I think that was my last leg. 2 more and you're out, Harris." "You have to take them yet," Ralph said. But the look of fury he flashed at Tom told him that he knew it was inevitable. Tom would beat him, as he did every time they met, at whatever sport they played, just as he had at school, when they'd made him head boy, and Ralph had expected it would go to him. It was an obvious source of irritation to Ralph, and sometimes he could not conceal his annoyance. Tom had consistently beaten him at darts, football, and at everything else, other than science and maths, in which Tom came second, despite not trying. Ralph had come top in both, and yet it hadn't helped to ease his sense of inferiority, perhaps because he'd known Tom hadn't cared enough to try. He'd also wanted to be the captain of the football team at Chatteris School, but of course, Tom had been chosen every time because he was their best player and scored more goals than anyone else. "Let's get on with it then." Tom started with a score of 140 and went on to take the leg with 10 darts. He took the last leg with 9 darts, and the small smoky room erupted with cheers. A 9-darter was something special, and the only local man to ever do it that anyone could remember was Tom Gilbert. One of the reasons he was so popular in the village. He played in the local darts team as well as the football team, and his usual good humour and loyalty to his friends had made him a village hero. He was a legend in the boxing ring and disappointed his fans only by refusing to fight as often as they would like. Tom was surrounded by friends, slapping his back and offering him drinks. He accepted a beer and a pork pie. Despite his mother's huge meals, Tom was always hungry again before supper. He knew that if Ma had gone to bed, she would have left him a plate of sandwiches for his supper. He smiled at all his friends. It had been a good evening, apart from the incident with Fred.
and he would be an idiot to take notice of a few spiteful words. Lizzie would never carry on behind his back. Lizzie Jackson looked at herself in the bedroom mirror. Her lipstick was smudged, almost gone, from the events of that evening. The same evening Ralph had been beaten by Tom in the local darts tournament. Apparently, he'd left the Three Pickerels immediately the match was over, just as she'd been walking back home after visiting a friend in the village. Ralph had stopped and asked if she wanted a lift, and because it had started to rain, she'd said yes and got into his car. She'd thought he would take her straight home, but he hadn't. He'd driven down the road further and pulled into a field gateway. She'd known straight away that he was angry about something, but she still hadn't expected him to act the way he had. He'd pushed her back in her seat and started kissing her hard on the mouth. For a moment, Lizzie had allowed it, curious to know what it would be like. But then he'd started putting his hands in places she didn't want them, and she'd tried to stop him. But he'd thrust her back in her seat, and he'd taken what he wanted, ruthlessly and without her permission. Her hair was all over the place, and she looked like a woman who had been through a tussle, though after a while she hadn't fought him. She'd just let him get on with it. Shame made her flush hot all over. Why hadn't she fought harder? Lizzie hadn't meant it to happen. She hadn't intended to go out that evening at all. Her plan had been to do a home perm for her mother, because she didn't fancy going down the pub to watch Tom play darts. It was very much a male-dominated night, and it bored her to watch a load of grown men cheering wildly just because 3 little darts went in the red bit. In her opinion, it was just an excuse to drink and tell smutty jokes, and she had no intention of wasting her time. However, her mother had complained of a headache and said she was going to rest, so she'd gone to visit a friend instead and been stupid enough to get into Ralph's car on the way home. What a fool. She just hadn't expected him to do anything like that. He'd always seemed charming to her, but not that night. She should never have stopped to speak to him, never have got into the car at all, even though initially Ralph's obvious wealth had appealed to her, and she had been tempted by the suggestions he'd made at various times that he would take her to nice restaurants. Instead of treating her like a lady, as she thought he would, he'd treated her as though she was a slut. It was her own stupid fault for getting into his car. Lizzie was happy enough going for long walks on a pleasant night, but she liked it when Tom took her to the cinema in Ely or March, or best of all, to the dance on a Saturday night. Tom had the use of his father's car sometimes, and Lizzie looked forward to those nights out. Ralph had his own car, a special car that smelt of leather and his cologne, but he was no gentleman. The vague hints she'd heard about him not being trustworthy were all too true. What a fool she'd been. Lizzie knew Ralph's reputation was for dropping girls when he'd had enough of them. What on earth would she do if she fell for a child? No, surely it wouldn't happen. She couldn't be that unlucky. How was she ever going to face Tom again? Tears filled her eyes as his honest, loving face came to her mind. He wasn't as good-looking as Ralph, and he didn't have as much money, but she loved Tom. Deep down, she cursed the side of her nature that craved the things Tom couldn't give her. Nothing would happen, she told herself as she flicked her flame-coloured hair back from her pale face. This was just a foolish incident she would push from her mind, and it would never happen again. It mustn't, because if Tom ever guessed, he wouldn't want anything more to do with her. Why should he? He could have pretty much any girl in the district, and she'd been proud of the fact that he'd chosen her. She should never have let the smooth-talking Ralph charm her into his car. It was just that he represented all the things Lizzie had never had and craved. Her mother had been widowed when Lizzie was still a teenager, and money had always been tight. Glancing round the shabby room that was her bedroom, Lizzie knew she wanted so much more than this, and yet she did love Tom. Lizzie's green eyes filled with tears. She'd been such a silly idiot. Why hadn't she just sent Ralph off? Staring into the dressing table mirror, Lizzie lifted her head. With any luck, Tom would never need to know. Chapter 3. What do you mean you want to leave school in the summer? Pam looked at her 16-year-old daughter in dismay that Friday tea time. Arthur's chair was empty. He'd gone to fetch their youngest child home from her friend's house. I thought you'd had your future all planned. I did, but I'm bored with school and exams. I want to leave and go to work in the hairdressing salon in Sutton with Lizzie, Susan said, looking down at the floor. Please let me, Mum. Susan was the only one of her children to call her that, Pam reflected. All the boys called her Ma, and her youngest girl was still saying Mummy. She looked at her daughter, who was studiously avoiding her gaze. Now tell me the real reason you want to leave school, she said. What has upset you, love? Susan hesitated. Then, there's this girl in my form at school, she said reluctantly. She's been saying things, Mum. I told her she was a liar, and she said I was stupid like all my family. So I hit her, and I had to go to Miss Hilda's room, and she lectured me and stopped all privileges for a month. Susan's eyes filled with tears. I was supposed to be in the summer pageant, but now I've been told I can't. I've got to stay in and write down things, like I mustn't hit people. And she got away without even being told off. It isn't fair, and I want to leave. Are you going to let that girl ruin your chance of a good career? Pam said, shaking her head. You were in the wrong, Susan. You shouldn't have hit her, no matter what she'd said. But she called Lizzie a bad name. Said she'd been doing things that no decent girl would, and that Tom was a fool to put up with it. What sort of a bad name? Pam asked. It's all right. I'll allow you to say it this once. She said she was no better than a prostitute, that she'd been doing things in the back of Ralph Harris's car. Disgusting things. Susan looked at her. I like Lizzie, Mum. She wouldn't do anything dirty, I know. I wouldn't have thought so, Pam said, and frowned. What is this girl's name, Susan? I think I'll have a word with her myself. Jennifer Barker. She's Fred Barker's sister. And apparently Tom knocked him down in the pub last week. There was a fight? Pam frowned. She hadn't heard anything about it from anyone. But now she came to think about it, Tom had been a bit quiet this last week. I wonder if your dad knows. I'll ask him about that. But I'll speak to Jennifer about this myself. It needs getting to the bottom of, Susan. In the meantime, you keep out of mischief and ignore this girl's taunts. Tom is big enough to look after himself. But I don't want you getting into trouble because of what might just be spite. All right. Susan accepted her decision, though she still looked miserable. I know I shouldn't have hit her, Mum, but she was being horrid. Some girls can't help themselves. I'll have a word with the headmistress and explain. Perhaps she will reinstate you in the summer pageant, love. But if she doesn't, you'll just have to concentrate on your work. Your dad has set his heart on you becoming a teacher. And you know it is what you want, don't you? Yes, Mum. But I don't like folk calling Lizzie names and mocking Tom. Susan was very fond of her half-brother, who was always kind and considerate of her feelings. John teased her, and Artie tended to ignore her. But Tom always smiled and listened when she needed him. No, darling, nor do I, Pam said. Shush now. Here's Angela home from playing with her friends. No more talk of bad names. They both turned as Arthur entered with his youngest child. Angela had been to a friend's birthday party after school for a special tea. She'd taken her present to school, all wrapped up in pretty tissue. and she'd brought a paper plate with a piece of birthday cake and a cracker home with her.
"These are for you, Mummy,"
she said, and planted a sticky kiss on Pam's face as she bent to hug her.
"Mrs. Miller was lovely, and she said to bring this for you and remind you it's the meeting on Thursday next week."
Like most women in the local villages and towns, Pam attended regular meetings of the Women's Institute once a month. They made jams and cakes, exchanged recipes and gossip, and drank lots of tea. It was a break from the routine of home for the hard-working wives of busy farmers and land workers, and Pam seldom missed a meeting.
"Well, wasn't that kind of Mrs. Miller?"
Pam said, and smiled warmly at her 6-year-old. Angela had been a surprise to her parents after a long gap between her and Susan, but she was nonetheless loved for being unexpected, and Arthur thought the world of her.
"Won't you have a cup of tea?"
she asked her husband, as she saw he was about to go out again.
"I'll give Tom a hand with the milking if he needs it,"
Arthur said.
"We'll be in as usual for our supper, Pam, love."
"All right." Pam smiled at him as he went out. She still loved the quiet, strong man she'd married years before. At first, she'd been overwhelmed by his kindness and unsure as to whether she loved him or was just grateful for what he'd offered her. But she'd learned to love him very quickly, and they'd made a good life on his substantial farm. Unlike many of the farms in the district, Arthur's was large enough to bring in a good income, far above the subsistence level that the small holdings would produce, and Pam had been given most things she wanted. In particular, her pride and joy, the bathroom upstairs, with its rolled-top bath, the flush toilet, and a hand basin. Only a very few homes in the district had a bathroom. Most folks still used the tin bath they hung outside on the scullery door when not in use, and an outside toilet. But Pam had a bathroom fit for a queen. It had cost Arthur a packet and proved that he was a man of his word. He'd told her he would give her the world, and he had. She'd never forgotten she was lucky to be loved by a man like Arthur, or that he'd taken Tom on and never treated him any differently to his own children. In fact, when it came to the farm, Tom's was the voice Arthur listened to most. He was a skilled landsman, and Arthur appreciated the hours he put in, far more than his labourer's wage warranted. He'd never asked for more, though he could have gone to one of the big farms in the district and been taken on as a foreman if he'd chosen.
"I get my wage, my keep, and the use of the truck when I want it,"
Tom had said when someone mentioned a good job going with one of the larger landowners.
"What more do I want? Your own land one day?"
Tom had nodded.
"If I do, I'll buy it when I'm ready."
Tom expected nothing from his stepfather, even though Arthur had hinted he would look after him. He did what he did because it was right after the way Arthur had taken him on as a babe. Totally oblivious to her mother's thoughts, Susan pounced on the slice of cream sponge that Mrs. Miller had sent and ate it, despite Angela's protests that it was for Mummy. Pam soothed things over.
"It's all right, darling. Susan knows I don't eat much cake. I like a bit of plain cake or fruit cake, but not fancy stuff. She can have it."
Angela shrugged and went to play with the kittens in their box in the corner of the kitchen. Arthur had found them in the barn, apparently abandoned by the stray cat he'd seen a few days earlier.
"They'll die if she doesn't come back, but I reckon they're old enough to survive if you look after them, love,"
Arthur had said.
"As if I didn't have enough to do,"
Pam had replied, but she'd laughed. For a tough farmer who cheerfully sent bullocks off to market, he was remarkably soft when it came to little helpless animals like those kittens. Perhaps that was why he'd captured her heart instead of just her gratitude.
"Can I keep one of them for a pet?"
Angela asked now, cradling 3 of them on her lap.
"Please, Mummy."
"I expect so.
They'll all stay on the farm anyway." Your dad says they keep the rats and mice down. Lord knows how many he'll end up with before he's done.
People will ask for them, and he'll give them to good homes, Susan said, and bent down to pick one up and stroke it. A lot of them disappear after a while. They either get run over on the road or wander off. These strays are always a bit on the wild side. At least that is what Tom says. He thinks that we should have the tomcats neutered, but Dad won't let him. He says nature takes its own path.
Susan! Pam frowned at her daughter. That is hardly a fit subject for my kitchen. It's what Tom says, Susan replied, pouting. Tom is a grown man, and you're a young girl.
What's neutered mean?
Angela asked, looking up at her. Nothing for you to bother your head over.
It means they won't have more kittens, Susan said, and Pam sent her a warning glance. Well, it does, and a teacher should explain things in the best way possible.
Pam sighed. Her children had minds of their own. She supposed that was down to both her and Arthur. They had brought them up to be independent and honest, and what Susan had told her younger sister was perfectly true. Luckily, Angela had lost interest and was stroking two of the kittens, a tortoiseshell and a black one with a white spot on his face.
Oh, I can't decide which I like best, Angela said, plainly in a dilemma. Which should I keep, Susan?
We'll keep them both, her sister said. One for you and one for me. I'll help you look after them so they won't cause any trouble. Angela's face lit up.
Can we, Mummy?
I expect so. Pam bent to put a large apple and cinnamon pie in the oven. Her eldest boy and Arthur were very partial to a slice of apple pie after supper. But then they loved jam roly-poly or treacle tart just as much. Pam quietly observed Tom as he ate his supper. There was no doubt that he was a little subdued. She wondered if he'd heard the rumours about Lizzie, but didn't ask. When Arthur and the other lads left, Arthur for his walk about the farm and the others for various pursuits, Tom sat on at the table, staring into space, still holding his teacup. That must be cold, love. Would you like another? Tom blinked and looked at her, pushing the cup away. No thanks, Ma. I was lost in my thoughts. I can see that. Is anything wrong? Tom hesitated and then looked at her. I'm not sure, he said in his slow, thoughtful way. If you wanted to ask an awkward question, Ma, but you thought it might upset someone, would you still do it? Yes, if I really needed to know the answer. She hesitated then. Do you really want to know, Tom? The answer might be one you don't like. Tom looked at her steadily. It might, but I need to know, Ma. I can't live with the uncertainty. Go on, then. Ask it, she said, bracing herself to answer fairly. But he simply nodded, pushed his chair back, and rose to his feet. Where are you going? To see Lizzie. He looked at her, and she saw the puzzlement and hurt in his eyes. I knocked Fred Barker down for saying it, but I met Ralph Harris in the market in Ely yesterday, and the smug look in his eyes is haunting me. I have to know if she has been with him, Ma. Oh, Tom. Pam wanted to comfort him, but what could she say? She didn't know the truth, and it was pointless in assuring him Lizzie wouldn't do anything wrong when she didn't know. The rumours were clearly circulating in the farming community, or Susan wouldn't have picked them up at school. It's all right, Ma. I need to know. Tom picked up his working jacket and went out without another word. The very fact that he had gone to see Lizzie without a wash and change out of his working things told her a lot. Tom was upset and angry, and she knew that he had a temper on him when it was roused, just like his father, Tommy Gilbert. Normally gentle and easygoing, once he was angry, he was inclined to use his fists. But he wouldn't hurt Lizzie. He was more likely to go after the man involved.
Pam wanted to call him back and tell him to be careful, but he had gone, and she heard the sound of the truck starting in the yard. He always took Arthur's car when he went to meet Lizzie, but not that evening. Lizzie saw the truck draw up from her bedroom window. Tom hadn't been round for a week, and that told her that something was wrong. He couldn't know what she'd done with Ralph that night. She hadn't told anyone, and it had been dark in that field gateway. No one could have seen them, surely. And yet Lizzie had had a couple of strange looks when she went to the grocery shop in Meeple to pick up her mother's weekly shopping. She had a distinct feeling that she was being talked about, and it made her uneasy. If there were rumours going round, Tom could have heard them. He sat in the truck in the dark, making no move to get out and come to her house. Lizzie usually made him come to the door, but this time she went to him, slowly, reluctantly, her heart heavy and her feet dragging. She opened the door and slipped into the seat beside him. She could smell the strong odours of the farm clinging to his boots and clothes. Normally he smelled of soap and talcum powder. Tom didn't turn his head to look at her or take her in his arms to kiss her.
"Is it true what they're saying? That you went with Ralph Harris in his car?"
Now he turned to look at her, and she sensed his deep hurt as he asked,
"Did he have you, Lizzie? Did you go with him that way?"
She was tempted to lie, to pretend that it hadn't happened, but she couldn't. He deserved the truth, however much it hurt them both. "Yes," she said. "It happened once. I didn't mean it to, and I regretted it immediately. I'm sorry, Tom. I wish I hadn't gone near him." She didn't tell him she'd been forced, because it sounded like an excuse, and it was her own fault for getting in the car. Tom didn't answer. He didn't ask her to explain or question her. He didn't even get angry. She wished he would just slap her a bit and then forgive her, but his silence drove into her heart like a knife. She waited for a while, but he didn't speak again, just sat staring into the darkness. "I'm sorry, Tom. Why don't you say something? Please get angry or hit me or something."
"Why?"
He spoke at last, and each word was like a nail being driven into her heart.
"It was your choice. You are not my property, Lizzie. You have the right to do whatever you want."
She wanted to force him to understand that she'd made a mistake, that she still loved him, and she wanted him to punish her and then forgive her. But his stony coldness stopped her. She waited for a moment longer, but then she knew. It was no use. Tom would never forgive her. It was over. It was finished. He would consider her spoiled goods, and he wouldn't want her now. "I'm sorry," she said again, and got out of the truck, walking swiftly back to the house and in through the kitchen door.
"Was that Tom's truck I heard?" her mother asked. "Why doesn't he come in?"
"He hasn't changed. He wants an early night," Lizzie lied, holding back the tears so that her mother should not see her distress. She would cry when she got to her own room.
"Is something wrong? Have you broken up with him, Lizzie? He hasn't been over for a week."
Lizzie didn't answer. She ran up the stairs, pausing on the landing to look out in time to see Tom drive away. She'd hoped he would come to the house and ask for her, and after a shouting match they would make it up. But in her heart, she'd known he wouldn't. Tom was too proud. She should have been content to be his girl, and one day his wife. But it was too late now. Lying down on her bed, Lizzie wept until there were no tears left. It was over. Tom would never come courting again. And with the rumours she was now certain were circulating locally, she wouldn't stand much chance of a decent relationship here. Men would try to date her, but they'd be after one thing, and she didn't want to be thought easy. Lizzie had made a mistake, giving in to a silver-tongued rogue, and she didn't intend to repeat it. After her tears had dried, Lizzie lay and thought for a while. And then she got up and started to pack her clothes and everything she treasured into a suitcase and a large soft bag. She wouldn't stay here to be pointed at and vilified. Lizzie had always wanted to work at a big hairdressing salon in London, and now she was ready to give it a try. She had some savings in the post office because she'd been putting a slice of her wages aside for her wedding clothes. Now she would use it for her new adventure. She would put Tom out of her mind and find a new life in London. Tom drew into the farmyard gate, switched the engine off, and sat staring into the darkness. He felt sick and angry and wanted to go storming over to March and batter the man who had dared to use his Lizzie that way. But he knew he wouldn't stop at a beating. If he met Ralph Harris now, he would kill him. It had taken all his iron will not to give Lizzie a good slapping, but he'd never lifted a finger to a woman in his life, and didn't intend to start now. God, it hurt. He'd wanted to make love to Lizzie so many times, but he'd always held back, respecting her, loving her, wanting to wait until they were married. He didn't want his Lizzie to go through what his mother had when she'd fallen for his father. Ma had never complained once in his earshot, and she told him how much she and his father loved one another. "We would have wed as soon as he returned," she told Tom. "Don't think badly of him, Tom. He never meant it to happen like that." That it had happened was what mattered to Tom, and he'd been determined to keep his Lizzie safe from wagging tongues. The bitter irony was hard to take, but he'd had to know the truth. Yet he had no idea what he would do next. Tom closed his eyes as the pain struck. What would happen to Lizzie if she was pregnant with that bastard's baby? Would he marry her? Why did Tom care? He wasn't sure. But if Lizzie was in trouble because of that rotten devil, he would make him pay. He got out of the truck, slammed the door and locked it, and went into the kitchen. His mother was ironing. She always seemed to be working. "Why don't you sit down with a book or something?" he asked. "Don't you ever get time for some fun, Ma?" "I enjoy looking after my family," she said. "I read that new Agatha Christie novel when John has finished it. I usually read for an hour or so in bed." She saw his worried look and smiled. "When I want time off, I'll take it, Tom. I go to the meetings when I feel like it, and if friends come round, I'll sometimes sit chatting half the morning." She smiled. "I'm my own boss, love, and I do what I want. The farm and my family are my life." "Don't you want to go dancing or to the sea for a change?" "I went dancing every week when I was young, and it was nice. But these days, I'd just as soon sit and knit a new cardigan for Angela or make Susan a new dress. Your dad took me to the sea for a week the year before last. You know he did." "We had to push him out of the house, and you said he fretted the whole week." "Well, most of it," his mother laughed. "That's why I don't bother Tom. He couldn't relax, and that meant I had to keep reassuring him. When he retires, I'll get him to take me to France. I've always wanted to go there. Paris and Versailles." "Romantic at heart, aren't you?" Tom smiled at her. "If he doesn't take you, I will." "And I'll come," she said. "But not while your dad needs to be here. He needs me with him, see?" "Yes, I do see," Tom said. "I wonder if he knows how lucky he is to have you." "Oh, he knows," she replied. "I'm lucky too, Tom. He's given me a good life here on the farm." "Some women want more." "Is that why Lizzie went off the rails?" his mother asked. Her clear eyes looked at him with sympathy and understanding. "Maybe she was bored.
She said she was sorry.
I'm sure she didn't. Are you going to forgive her, Tom? Tom met her eyes.
Should I, Ma? I know anyone can make a mistake, but will she do it again? I couldn't forgive her if she did.
I shouldn't expect you to, because that would be willful choice. But that Ralph has a bad reputation for leading girls astray.
Are you man enough to do it, Tom?
Arthur was, and he's never reminded me by a look or a word.
You didn't know Arthur when it happened. It was different.
Yes, it was different, she admitted. But in the end, it comes down to whether you're strong enough to forgive her and never make her pay for it. If you can't put it in the past, then let her go now.
You're a wise old bird, Ma, Tom said with an odd smile. I'm not sure how I feel yet.
Give it a while then, but don't leave it too long, Tom. Lizzie will be suffering remorse, and she can't forgive herself until you forgive her, love.
Tom nodded. I'm going upstairs. I'll have a bath and then get to bed. I don't feel like talking to anyone else.
Thank you for talking to me, she said, and smiled gently at him.
Not so much of the old next time.
Tom gave a short laugh and went out. He walked upstairs to the bathroom. He was lucky to have his parents, he knew that, and he got on fine with his half-brothers and sisters. But it was better to keep out of their way for a while until he was fit company again. Lizzie's betrayal had shocked him, hurting more than he'd expected. It was true, he'd never asked for her promise to be his exclusively, but he'd expected it. Yes, he'd expected loyalty, and it hurt that she'd let him down. Was it just his pride, or did he love her so much that life would be empty without her? Tom knew he needed to give it a lot of thought, because his mother was right. If he wanted her anyway, he had to be man enough to forget what she'd done and never remind her. He wasn't sure he was strong enough, and it made him appreciate Arthur more than ever. His stepfather was a good man. Stripping off his clothes, Tom stood in the chilly bathroom, his muscles hard and strong, his body tall and vibrant with health, in the reflection in the mirror on the wall. Not that he bothered to look. He had no vanity, and a quick flick of the comb through his hair after he'd shaved